Stop watering your garden every day. If you're dragging hoses across your yard every evening, adjusting sprinklers, worrying about dry soil the moment the sun comes out, you don't have a water problem. You have a system problem. For years, I thought watering frequently meant I was being responsible. The weather got hot, I watered. Leaves looked slightly droopy, I watered. Soil felt dry at the surface, I watered again. And every summer, I felt chained to the routine. Miss one day and plants looked stressed. Go away for a weekend and everything suffered. It wasn't gardening, it was maintenance. But then I started paying attention to something simple. In nature, nobody waters forests. Nobody drags hoses through meadows. And yet plants survive heat waves, dry spells, and long stretches without rain. Why? Because natural systems don't depend on surface moisture. They depend on depth. Most gardens are designed for shallow roots. Frequent light watering trains plants to keep their roots near the surface. That's where the water is. So that's where the roots stay. The result? The moment the surface dries out, the plant panics. And we respond by watering again. It becomes a cycle of dependency. But when water moves deep into the soil, roots follow. And deeper roots mean access to stable moisture reserves that don't evaporate by noon. The problem isn't that we don't water enough. It's that we water wrong. Low input living isn't about ignoring plants and hoping for the best. It's about building soil that acts like a reservoir. Healthy soil doesn't just hold nutrients, it holds water. Organic matter behaves like a sponge. Fungal networks transport moisture. Undisturbed soil creates channels where water can move downward instead of running off. But if soil is compacted, exposed, or constantly disturbed, water can't penetrate properly. It either pools at the top or disappears too quickly, so we compensate with frequency. More watering, more effort, more monitoring, and the cycle continues. The turning point for me came during a particularly hot stretch one summer. I was exhausted from trying to keep up. The garden looked decent, but it required daily attention. I started asking a different question. What would have to change so this garden could survive without me hovering over it? That question shifted everything. Because instead of thinking about irrigation systems or timers or more efficient sprinklers, I started thinking about soil structure. The first change I made wasn't expensive. It wasn't technical, and it definitely wasn't impressive. I stopped leaving soil exposed, that's it. Most gardens are designed around neatness. Clean rows, bare pathways. Dark soil visible between plants. It looks organized, it looks intentional. But bare soil is a liability. The moment sunlight hits exposed ground, moisture begins evaporating. Wind accelerates it. Heat bakes the surface. Within hours, the top layer dries out, even if deeper layers are still moist. And what do we see? Dry soil, so we water again. But when soil is covered, truly covered, everything changes. I began using what was already available. Chopped plant trimmings, leaves. Straw when I had it. Even weeds cut before they went to seed. Instead of clearing them away, I laid them directly on the soil surface. Not thinly, generously. Within weeks, I noticed something subtle but powerful. When I pulled back the mulch layer midday during heat, the soil underneath was cool. Cool soil loses water slowly. Cool soil protects microbial life. Cool soil stabilizes roots. Mulch acts like insulation. It shields soil from direct sun and reduces wind exposure. It also slows down the impact of heavy rain, allowing water to soak in instead of compacting the surface. But here's where most people misunderstand mulch. They use it like decoration. A thin layer scattered lightly across the top does very little. For a garden to begin regulating its own moisture, coverage needs to be consistent and meaningful, not suffocating plants, but fully protecting exposed ground. And something interesting happens when soil stays covered long term. Earthworms increase, fungal growth expands. Organic matter accumulates slowly beneath the surface. That builds structure. And structure determines how much water your soil can hold. Think of healthy soil like a sponge. Compacted soil is more like a plate. Water runs off or sits on top. But sponge-like soil absorbs and stores moisture deeper, where evaporation can't easily reach it. When I combined thick surface coverage with less frequent but deeper watering, the effect compounded. Instead of watering lightly every day, I watered deeply and then left the soil alone longer. At first, plants looked slightly uncomfortable between waterings. Leaves weren't as perky, the surface looked dry, but I forced myself to wait. And something important happened. Roots started chasing moisture downward. Plants adapted. After a few weeks, they stopped reacting to surface dryness because they weren't dependent on it anymore. That's when I realized something critical. Most watering stress is trained behavior. We train plants to expect constant surface moisture. Then we panic when they respond accordingly. But if you train roots to go deep, your entire system becomes more stable. Less frequent watering, stronger plants, better drought tolerance, and it starts with something simple. Stop exposing soil. The second shift had nothing to do with mulch. It had to do with disturbance. For a long time, I believed loosening soil regularly was helpful. Tilling, turning, breaking things up so roots could breathe. It felt productive. The soil looked fluffy. It looked ready, but that fluffy texture disappears quickly. After the first heavy rain, tilled soil settles. Pores collapse, surface crust forms, and water either runs off or pools unevenly. What I didn't understand at the time was that soil structure isn't built by tools. It's built by life. When soil is left undisturbed, fungal networks spread. Microbes form aggregates, tiny clusters that bind soil particles together. Earthworms create channels that act like natural irrigation tunnels. Roots grow, die, and leave behind pathways for water to follow. Those pathways are gold. Water doesn't just soak randomly into healthy soil. It follows existing channels downward. It moves through worm tunnels. It spreads along fungal highways. It infiltrates deeper layers instead of evaporating at the surface. But when we till, we reset that system. We break fungal threads. We collapse worm tunnels. We disrupt aggregates, and then we wonder why water doesn't penetrate well. So I stopped turning my beds. Instead of mixing compost into the soil, I layered organic matter on top and let rain, worms, and microbes move it down gradually. At first, the surface looked less worked. It didn't have that freshly tilled appearance. But when I observed how water behaved during storms, I saw the difference. Instead of puddling, it disappeared. Instead of running off, it soaked in. Over time, I could water deeply once and leave the garden alone for longer stretches. The soil itself was managing distribution. That's when the phrase self-watering began to make sense. It doesn't mean no water ever touches the garden. It means the soil becomes capable of storing and distributing what it receives. Healthy soil holds far more water than most people realize. A small increase in organic matter can dramatically improve retention, and when combined with intact structure, that retention becomes accessible to plant roots even days after rainfall. There's also a psychological shift here. When you stop disturbing soil constantly, you stop reacting to every small change on the surface. Dry top layer? That doesn't mean dry root zone. Slight midday droop? That doesn't mean emergency. You begin trusting depth instead of surface signals, and trust reduces intervention. Low input living isn't about ignoring warning signs. It's about building systems where warning signs become rare. By protecting soil with cover and leaving structure intact, I removed two of the biggest causes of constant watering, evaporation and poor infiltration. But there was one more adjustment that tied everything together. It wasn't about soil, it was about plant selection and spacing, and it made the biggest difference of all. Even with covered soil and undisturbed structure, I was still making one mistake. I was choosing plants that demanded constant moisture. Some crops are naturally shallow-rooted. Some are bred for speed over resilience, and some simply evolved in climates that don't match mine. But I was planting them anyway, because that's what everyone grows. That realization forced me to look at something uncomfortable. Was I designing my garden around aesthetics and tradition, or around stability? Certain vegetables thrive in consistent moisture and cool conditions. Others tolerate heat, dryness, and irregular rainfall surprisingly well once established. Yet most backyard gardens treat every plant the same. Identical spacing, identical watering schedules, identical expectations. But plants aren't identical. Tomatoes, for example, can grow surprisingly deep roots when encouraged. But if they're watered lightly every day, they stay shallow. Peppers can become drought tolerant once mature, but only if not babied constantly. Many herbs, rosemary, thyme, oregano, actually prefer leaner, drier soil once established. Yet we often overwater them out of habit. Then there's spacing. When plants are crammed too tightly, their roots compete aggressively in a shallow zone. That competition increases stress and forces more frequent watering. But when spacing allows roots to expand outward and downward without immediate competition, moisture becomes more accessible. I started adjusting both. I leaned into plants that could handle some neglect. I gave them room to stretch. I stopped trying to maximize every square inch for visual fullness. And I noticed something powerful. When plants weren't constantly stressed by crowding and shallow moisture, they developed thicker stems, leaves stayed firm longer, root systems grew stronger. and the need for daily watering faded even more. It wasn't dramatic overnight, it was gradual. But the compounding effect of soil cover, no disturbance, deeper watering, and smarter plant choices created something that felt radically different from my old routine. I wasn't hovering anymore. I wasn't reacting to every hot afternoon. I could water deeply and then walk away. The garden wasn't dependent on daily attention. It had buffer. That word matters. Buffer is what makes a system resilient. If a single missed watering session causes visible stress, the system lacks buffer. If a few hot days pass and plants remain stable, buffer exists. And buffer comes from design. Low input living isn't about eliminating work entirely. It's about building enough buffer into your systems that work becomes occasional instead of constant. Once I stopped trying to control surface moisture and started building depth in soil, in roots, in structure, watering became less of a chore and more of a strategic input. And that changed the entire feel of the garden. So what does a self-watering garden actually mean? It doesn't mean never watering again. It doesn't mean ignoring drought. And it definitely doesn't mean plants magically survive without rain. What it means is this: the soil becomes capable of holding, storing, and distributing water efficiently enough that you're no longer required to intervene constantly. That's a huge difference. A high-input garden depends on frequency. Miss a day and it shows. Skip a weekend and it struggles. Everything is balanced on daily maintenance. A low-input garden depends on depth. Deep roots, deep organic matter. Deep moisture reserves, deep structure. When rain falls, it soaks in instead of running off. When you water, it penetrates instead of pooling. When the surface dries, moisture remains available below. And when heat arrives, plants aren't shocked because they've been trained to access stable layers beneath. That's the real shift. You stop managing symptoms and start strengthening foundations. The steps aren't complicated. Keep soil covered. Stop disturbing structure. Water deeply but less often. Choose plants that tolerate your climate. Space them for resilience instead of appearance. Individually, each one helps. Together, they compound. The first season I committed to this fully, I still carried a hose, but I used it less. The second season, I stopped thinking about watering every single day. By the third, the garden felt different. It felt steady. Even during hot stretches, there wasn't panic. There wasn't that evening rush to save everything. There was buffer, and that buffer gave me freedom. Because here's the truth most people don't say out loud. If your garden can't survive without daily attention, it's not sustainable long term. Life gets busy, weather changes, energy fluctuates. Systems that require constant supervision eventually burn you out. Low input living isn't about growing less food. It's about growing it in a way that doesn't demand your presence every evening. When soil holds water properly, when roots grow deep, when structure remains intact, the garden begins to cooperate instead of compete for your time. That's what I mean by self-watering. Not magic, design. If this way of thinking resonates with you, stay with the channel. We're continuing to break down common gardening habits and rebuilding them into systems that require less effort over time. Because the goal isn't to work harder in the heat. It's to build soil that works for you. And once you experience that shift, it's hard to go back.